Hi, welcome to Blank Canvas. My name is Maureen Newton and we're here in Inspire Studio, my studio in downtown Medicine Hat. And we're continuing on part 2 with doing this study of a small cat painting. And it's inspired by a painting that I just finished that has a cat in it, which is a reoccurring theme that I enjoy painting. And we're just going to be continuing on with the building blocks of a painting. So we've started with the layout, adding in the building blocks of color with oil paint, and now just finishing off with the finishing details, as I call it. So when you're using a brush, generally you fill in the background areas with larger brushes, and as you get more and more into the detail, that is when you will go and use your smaller brushes. This reference picture of the cat kind of has a half and half, sort of like a yin and yang, a shadow side and a lighter side that I find quite interesting that I haven't quite captured yet. And usually the earlier stages of a painting tend to look a little bit more flat. And as you progress with your painting, I call it the push and pull. You want to define more of the highlights and kind of create more of those darks that get somewhat lost as you're building up your painting. I have a tendency to keep sort of my brushes in the colors that I'm using. So I have the blue brush I'm still using, the dark one, and the light ones. Because with oil painting, I don't want to keep continually cleaning my brushes and going back. So I have a tendency to just kind of keep them with the colors. And so I have, quite a few brushes out, and I'll tend to use all of them rather than trying to clean my brushes in between. Because this is a fairly monochromatic image, I've basically got the color of the cat, so it's the earth colors and the colors of the branches here. I'm just going to continue to fill in some of those layers of the browns. Add a little bit of green here, just mix that with the burnt umber. So I'm using the titanium white again. And I just want to fill in a little bit, just get a little bit more green in there, just to change that so it has a slightly different base to it than the cat itself. And just add a little bit more green, just to make that brown a little bit more greenish as I go. And I'm leaving those dark areas that I kind of put in. Now, obviously, with a quicker study like I'm doing, I'm not getting as much detail as I would if I were spending more time on a painting. Quite often with my paintings, I let it dry in between, and then I'll continue on with the layering and really tweaking that detail at the very end. But for this particular image, I'm just being a little bit faster. And artists like the group of 7, they did their paintings a little bit quickly out in the field and their landscapes, and then when they worked in the studio, they would quite often use those paintings as reference or spend more time and more detail back when they were in the comfort of their studio. So that's kind of the place for those alla prima kind of paintings here. So I want to capture this little shadow area. So like I was saying, most often you use the ultramarine and the burnt umber together. So this is kind of like a little study in those two colors with the white added in. And it really does make beautiful gray colors as well. So I'll get a little bit of this shadow area that the cat has cast on the tree. Now the tricky part again with oil is just simply those kinds of colors that get picked up, and want to make this look like it's coming up and over the roundness of the tree here. Get that in. Now you can use black, obviously. You just want to be careful. I'm going to use some little touches of black for in and around the cat's eyes and things like that to make those stand out a little bit. We'll just get this there a little bit tighter over here using my brush kind of in that floating technique. And so what you're really doing is suggesting what you're looking at. So we're suggesting that shape of that shadow actually brings over, supposed to make that look like it's a little bit more round on that side. So we'll just get some, a little bit of the highlights. So you'll notice that I'm holding my brush kind of a little bit more at an angle, just to get that, again, that floating technique with the oil paint. Because once it's wet, it's the trickiest part is just trying to get those darker colors. You almost have to decide which areas will be dark. If you get too much light, then when you go back in to get your darks in, it can be a little bit tricky getting those colors back in again. I just like to pick up a little bit of, I'm using a little bit of purple as I go, and we'll get just sort of that there. And I want to go, now I'm just picking up a little tiny bit of black just to add into that brown and blue. In theory, when you use black, it's supposed to make your colors look darker, when in actuality, when you add black to most colors, like to yellow, it doesn't make darker yellow, it actually makes kind of a really mucky green color. So the only color it really works with, are the blues and purples and things. Otherwise, it just kind of makes mud. So I tend to use some watercolor brushes that are a little bit smaller. And oil painting brushes are made out of hog hair, and they tend to be a little bit stiffer, and they're quite tricky to get a nice, thin, clean line with them. So I use these thinner brushes just for little finishing details. And when you're working on a bigger canvas, there's a moss stick that you can use where you can actually steady your hand. Because when you try to actually paint some of your little details in, it tends to get a little bit shaky. So now I'm just going to go in and darken up a little bit of these little details around the eye. And just making the top of the eye a little bit darker and a little bit in there. And a little bit around this. So years ago I heard this saying, and I believe it's attributed to Matisse, but he said, a painting is never finished, it just stops in interesting places. So when you do a study and you have, like an hour or more limited amount of time to work, you're just capturing less of the detail. And as you keep working on that, it gets more and more realistic as you go. So this is obviously going to be more of a sketch, but I'm just looking as I'm going at my study, at my reference here, just seeing which little details are sort of standing out to me and getting a little bit more of that dark line put in, seeing where these little parts come out. Now that was probably a little bit more than I wanted, so I can just go back in with my other brush. Get a little bit more of the dark shadow on this side. I really think I'm very drawn to things with high contrast, and the way I paint has a tendency to, have almost like an element of that dark outline to it. And that's just something I really enjoy. Get a little bit more. Now I've got to make the color of the eyes here. And I'll eventually go back in and get a little bit more of the white on the one side. This is quite a bit darker. Now when you're painting with oils, I quite enjoy the brush strokes, the interpretation. Like I always want it to look like it has been painted, obviously. But some people really like to smooth that out. Obviously, when you're painting an animal that's furry, you want it to have that texture, so it's quite conducive to brush strokes, which is get some of these little stripes in there. And this is really where the floating aspect comes in, like especially where I have some of this white. Want to get those kind of lines back in there. Now this is a little bit more again than I intended, so this is called the ragging out technique, where I'll just use a little bit of a cloth and just kind of set that in so it doesn't look so much like an abrupt. Where's my black? The nice thing about using the earth colors is they do have a tendency to be the fastest drying colors with oil painting. And I'm just squinting up and seeing where else I can get some of that darker shadow area as I'm building up here. Get a little bit more in the little chin area. So that was a little bit more than what I wanted, so I'll just kind of rag that out a little bit. And you don't really use the ragging out in acrylics at all. It's a very common technique with oil painting where you have to kind of wipe out certain areas that are a little bit wetter and apply the colors that are going to go on top. Let's get that detail of the mouth back in there. And so one thing I just want to add in at this point is to kind of get the color of the eyes a little bit better in there and the nose itself. So I have this kind of permanent rose color, and I'm just going to add a little bit of white to it, and it's a little bit too intense for the purpose of what I want. So I'm just going to tone that down a little bit. Just adding a little bit of brown to that so it's not quite so vibrant of a pink, but I do want it to be a little bit pinker to stand out, so we'll get that kind of in there, that little hint of and a little bit of a touch of the light at the top. It's the little highlight there. And then the other one that I want to get in there is the color of the eyes. So eyes are always a really interesting part of an animal. People will often say, you know, they look so realistic, and they're actually quite simple. Just taking a little bit of a permanent green color. And for this painting, I'm actually, because it's a study and kind of geared toward a student work, I'm just using Winton oil colors. And some of the difference between Winton, which is a nice student quality, as compared to the artist quality paints. Gamblin oils are one that I really like to use, and you know, they can be up to $30 or $40 for a small tube, whereas the Winton can be, you know, in around $10 per tube, depending on the size. So it's just, when you're learning, it's a little bit more of a reasonable cost for you, especially for this kind of thing where you're just practicing. So around the little dark part of the eye, now if you decide, you know, this little part, maybe I got a little bit too much of the dark in there, I can alter that a little bit. And I call it knocking it back. And really just allowing those brush strokes to be, they quite frequently are the really beautiful part for me. And I just lost my little black line right here. Now in the eye itself, there's always a dark part that's at the top of the eyelid, and there's a shadow that gets cast from that upper eyelid. So you want to make sure that, just got a little bit too much light in there. Just gonna try and get that back in there. So I've got that green area of the eye put in, but what I also want to do is lighten that up a little bit so that I get that nice little highlight. So this eye is a little bit more in the direct sunlight where my light source is. So I'm just gonna get a little bit more of a light part underneath here. And this one's a little bit, want that one to be a little bit darker. So this is always the tricky part with oil, because it's so wet. It's a little bit easier when you have the opportunity to leave it, but I'm just getting that contrast there a little bit. When you have the chance to leave it and let it dry a little bit, you can always go back in. And really the nice detail about the eye itself, just picking up a little bit of the white and going right in and just doing a little touch of that highlight there, and a little bit on that side too. So that has a tendency to just make those eyes pop a little bit. So I'm going to now go back in and get a little bit more of my highlights put in. So as I'm looking throughout, there's a little bit of a highlight there. Now I've got a little bit of pink that I picked up from my white. Get rid of that. Now quite often when I do that, I usually don't mind. I quite enjoy those little bits of color. Got some little highlights in here. So this is where you really have to use your brush to get those little colors floated on top. Like that. And if I decide, well, you know what, maybe that ear's a little bit longer, you could just repaint your negative space and just kind of tone that shape down a little bit. There's a nice little highlight over on this side, on this other ear over here, and that's something, just get that line in there. And then get a little bit more of that. A little bit of that dark in there. And I've got some little lines. And really using your brush as a tool for creating the shapes that you want. Get a little bit more of a little depth there. And there's a lovely little highlight that just comes right around that other eye. And sometimes the suggesting in a faster painting, in a study, is just trying to encapsulate a little bit more information with one stroke of your brush rather than getting a lot of detail in there. Get a little bit here. So when I work back into the light, if I get a little bit stronger than I want, I can just kind of blend that a little bit. And now I'm just kind of really squinting up and seeing where else it is that I can bring in a little bit more. A little bit over here. And just get my little finishing details in my study. And quite often I'll do little studies like this before I actually start a bigger, more realized painting, because it gives me an opportunity to perhaps just feel it out and see how I'm going to approach the painting, or just kind of familiarize myself with the image itself. Let's get a little bit darker on this side. And those little... And there are places like a fan brush comes quite in handy as well. So if I want, my brush strokes to show a little bit less, then I can actually use this just to kind of blend it a little. So, sort of in the side of the face, or this part in here where you just want to soften some of those, make them look a little bit more fur-like. It's great for grass and all kinds of things like that. Now there's still a little bit more of a darkness on this side that I want to capture, so I get more of that sense of the light and the dark. And again, I just kind of lost a little bit of my dark here with the fan. So again, that's one of the tricky parts with oil. Sometimes you do one little part and you might lose it as you go in, and you just have to kind of go back and forth that way. There's a little bit of some of these stripes I want to kind of get back in here. And some of these nice little touches of the darks again. So the push and pull is one of the things that I really stress and enjoy doing at the very end, getting those nice little highlighted touches in, and really looking and seeing where those nice little dark areas are going to come. So this little guy here is quite distinctly dark on this side, and that kind of ties in nicely with that little shadow on the tree. Get a little bit more of a slight highlight here. Kind of dragging that between, so I'm just trying to catch those little highlighted areas that you can see on the trunk. I always like this idea of the cat and the tree itself somewhat being similar in color, because it offers that feeling of being hidden somewhat. So that's something I kind of play up here. This needs a little more dark on this side. And quite often painting around something like this little thing here, you're not always painting the thing itself, but you're painting around it to make it get a little bit more of that reddy brown. So whenever you're painting the eyes as well, you just want to make sure it's pretty simple, but just getting that nice little highlighted hook in there, it really makes them stand out. And this painting done about this thickly would probably take anywhere from 4 or 5 days to be completely dry. And so one of the tricky parts with oil painting as well is actually getting whiskers and things like that in. You can use a very thin brush. I have this little liner brush that I like to use for whiskers. But because the paint is so wet, quite frequently when you go in to paint, it can be a little too thick, And this is something I do as well. It's nice to kind of rest your hand on your easel like this to steady yourself. But when you go to paint those lines in, quite frequently they're a little bit challenging to get those little details in, just because of the nature. So if you get this liner brush a little bit thin, it's got a longer hair, so it just does a nice little tip for you. And then on the other side, and just as I dragged it through the blue, I caught a little bit of blue paint and put that in, which I actually quite like. Those are some little things that I don't worry about too much. But when I have this little fine brush as well, I kind of go back in here and get a little bit of those details. The trickiest part with oil is just how do you get that information in without making it too muddy. So I'm just gonna get a little bit more. I got a little bit of blue here in my white. I'm just gonna pick up a little bit more of that. That was way more than what I wanted to get in there, but I will just get a little bit more of that highlight in there, up in here, and up in here. And just kind of touch up some little parts here, and we're pretty close to being done. Really just looking for the shapes of the highlighted parts. Painting quite often, especially with oil painting, it's quite frequently will have a slightly cruder look to it. For this reason, it gets a little bit harder to get that really fine detail. This is fairly muted in color, but it doesn't have to be. You know, oils have really luminous color quality to it. So quite often I'll just have a final look and see if there's any other little darks that not necessarily is it always just something I'm literally translating from the painting itself. Put those little lines back in. But just somewhere where it needs a little bit of a darker detail, just to make it stand out a little bit. And like I said, I'm not always just trying to do a literal photocopy or representation of the painting. For me, I'm actually just trying to do a painting that's inspired by what I'm looking at. So I'll then take away my reference and just see how pleased I am with what I have. So this, for me, would be a quicker study. Like I said, it's called alla prima when you do this all in one sitting. And usually it's practice or a warm-up painting for a larger piece. If you'd like to learn more about painting, you can find out more about Inspire Studio on our website at www.inspireart.ca. And there's a lot of other great places that teach classes in Medicine Hat. There's the Hat Art Club, the Strathcona Art Center, and also the Hive down the street from Inspire. So thank you for joining us today for Blank Canvas.